The greatest maritime empire rose from the desperation of refugees. In the 5th century, as Rome crumbled beneath the charge of barbarian horsemen, the people of Aquileia, Padua, and Altinum abandoned their homes. They fled to the one place the riders couldn't reach, the salty marshes of the lagoon. And it was these people, stripped of everything, who built a state without which our modern world would look completely different. Here are a few things around us that originated right here. The first industrial assembly line with standardized parts, built 600 years before Henry Ford. Legal casinos, carnivals, and the very foundation of the tourism industry. Anonymous tip-offs through special wall-mounted boxes backed by a secret police force above the law. The word slave in European languages, like slave and esclavo, comes from the ethnonym Slav because thousands of Slavs were sold here. Financial speculation based on secret intelligence and code breaking. The Venetian Republic created all of this, a state that began with a handful of refugees on muddy marshes without any arable land. Their ruthless pragmatism forced them to survive through trade, crushing rivals to monopolize salt and turning the Crusades into a profitable business venture with debts totaling 34,000 silver marks. Power fell into the hands of a closed council made up of the wealthiest families, while an ironclad order was maintained by a sinister secret service. But how did a small city on the swamp become a mighty maritime empire fueled by a secret council, a fleet, and spies? Let's take it step by step. The 5th century. The Western Roman Empire collapses like soggy cardboard. Waves of Goths, Huns, and Lombards crash down on the wealthy cities of northern Italy. Aquileia, one of the largest trading hubs of the late empire, home to nearly 100,000 people, is burned to the ground by Attila's army. Padua is looted. Altinum lies in ruins. And here's where the story gets fascinating. The people of these cities, not savages or barbarians, but former Roman citizens, merchants, artisans, educated and wealthy, don't flee south or to the mountains. Instead, they head to a place any sane person would avoid, the lagoon. 550 square kilometers of shallow water, salty tides, and soft mud. The water depth shifts with the tides every few hours, and solid ground is barely more than an idea. It sounds like the worst possible choice, but in reality, it was pure genius. Heavy Knight Cavalry, the main striking force of any army at the time, literally got stuck in the lagoon. A fully equipped horse weighs close to 1,500 pounds. The mud sucked it down up to its belly. A rider in chainmail wasn't a warrior. He was a sitting target, trapped knee-deep in thick muck. No commander in their right mind would lead cavalry into terrain like that. Wait, what about approaching by sea, on ships? It's possible, but the lagoon's shifting depths and hidden sandbanks acted like a trap. A large warship without a clear channel, a safe path through the shallows, would run aground like a whale beached on the shore. Stuck, helpless, with a crew that could only be pulled off like fish from a hook. In short, the lagoon was both a fortress wall and a moat, only carved not by human hands, but by nature itself. The Venetians quickly figured out how to turn this advantage to their favor. They devised a system of bricole, wooden piles driven deep into the muddy lagoon floor, marking safe channels. But only for their own. Local fishermen and traders knew the path. Follow the piles from one to the next, and you'd reach home safely. A stranger entering the lagoon for the first time faced nothing but endless gray-green water in every direction. No landmarks at all. Now here's the clever part. When an enemy fleet approached, the Venetians simply pulled out the piles. Just like that, the navigational guides vanished. Enemy ships ran aground one after another, their crews trapped. In a way, it was an early form of access control, only instead of a password, they used wooden stakes in murky water. And forgetting that password meant losing your ship. So, the most inhospitable spot on Italy's map became its safest refuge. But that safety came at a steep price: hunger. You couldn't plow the lagoon, you couldn't sow seeds, wheat or grapes would never grow here. Only salt water, mud, and wind stretched beneath their feet. Not a single acre of arable land in sight. When I started digging into Venice's history, this fact struck me hardest. People willingly chose a place where they couldn't feed themselves. That meant total, absolute dependence on the outside world. Every sack of grain, every barrel of wine had to be brought in. And to bring those goods, they had to offer something in return. Trade, negotiation, resale. No farmland left them with any other option, and in doing so, it sealed the city's entire destiny. Venice didn't rise as a trading empire out of ambition. It was driven by necessity. These people, former Romans, were sitting on stilts in the middle of a salty swamp. They had no army, no farmland, no stone walls. Yet they began to turn their weakness into strength. The water, which kept them from living like everyone else, gave them something in return. Roads. Sea roads, paths you don't have to build and can't be blocked. But to trade seriously, they needed a city. And building a city on nothing but shifting mud beneath their feet required nearly insane feats of engineering. Here's how it worked. A crew of workers drove whole, unshaped wooden logs, brought from the mainland on barges, deep into the muddy lagoon floor. Then another log, and another. Thousands of them, packed tightly side by side, until beneath their feet something resembling solid ground began to take shape. On top, they laid planks. On the planks, stone. This was the method for every building, every church, every palace. The entire city we recognize from postcards doesn't rest on earth. It's built on trees, hammered deep into the mud. To grasp the scale, let's look at one vivid example. The Santa Maria della Salute Cathedral, the one with the massive dome overlooking the Grand Canal. They laid its foundation in 1631, right after a plague wiped out a third of the population. That single building rests on 1,156,657 wooden piles driven into the ground. Over 1 million tree trunks supporting just one church. Imagine clearing a forest the size of a small suburban district and sinking it deep into a swamp. Construction took 50 years. And that's just one cathedral. The city itself was built over centuries. But here's the catch. Wood rots in water. Anyone who's seen an old fence left to decay knows this. So how do wooden piles hammered into wet mud 600, 700, even 1,000 years ago still hold up an entire stone city? The answer lies in chemistry, or rather, in its absence. Decay happens because of bacteria. Bacteria need oxygen to survive, but the dense, silty floor of the lagoon holds no oxygen. The piles sank into a sealed environment where air simply can't reach. Without oxygen, bacteria can't multiply. Without bacteria, the wood doesn't rot. Instead, something else happens. Minerals from the surrounding silt slowly seep into the wooden fibers, year after year, century after century. This process is called mineralization. The wood literally turns into stone. The piles, driven into the mud as temporary supports, gradually fossilized and became stronger than concrete. A city, planned as a temporary refuge, gained a foundation that would last for millennia. The engineering challenge was solved. Now came a different one: where to find the money. This is where the part of Venetian history that guidebooks tend to gloss over begins. The Republic's first big fortune came from trading people, not metaphorically, literally. Venetian merchants built a system to capture Slavic populations along the Dalmatian coast, that's modern-day Croatia, and then sell them in the markets of Egypt and the Levant. It was a well-oiled machine. Raid, capture, load onto ships, delivered to buyers. Venice grew so large that it became one of Europe's biggest hubs for the slave trade, and the mark of that business is still visible in language itself. The word for slave in most European languages, slave in English, esclavo in Spanish, actually comes from the word Slav. This isn't a coincidence, it's bookkeeping. For a Venetian merchant, there was no real difference between a barrel of salt and a person from the Dalmatian coast. Both were just entries in a ledger. Debit, credit, margin. The money earned from selling people went straight into building the very palaces tourists admire today. Remember this logic: goods are goods, whether they're alive or not. This idea will come back later in the story. But while the slave trade was profitable, it was just the accelerator. The true foundation of Venice's wealth was salt. To grasp why this matters, we need to take a moment and step back into the world of the Middle Ages. There were no refrigerators, no freezers, no vacuum sealing. The only way to preserve meat, fish, and vegetables through the winter was by salting them. In the 9th and 10th centuries, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was a survival tool. Without salt, you couldn't build up food stores. Without food stores, you couldn't survive the winter, feed an army, or outfit a trading caravan. Salt was a strategic resource, just like oil would become in the 20th century. And the Venetians understood this before anyone else. Salt was the Republic's first real source of wealth. They harvested it in the lagoon salt pans, then sold it on the mainland at a hefty markup. But Venice wasn't the only player in the salt game. To the south, on the coast, the thriving city of Comacchio stood as a major rival in the salt market. Venice tried to negotiate. It didn't work. So, they attacked Comacchio. They destroyed it. The city rebuilt. Venice struck again. In 932, Comacchio was wiped out for good, erased. The competitor vanished completely. After that, the Republic made its control official. It introduced the Ordo Salis, the Salt Code, a law requiring all nearby mainland cities to buy salt exclusively from Venice. Didn't want to comply? That was your choice. But military galleys patrolling the Adriatic would intercept any ship carrying unauthorized salt and send it to the bottom of the sea. Smugglers went down with their cargo. This wasn't trade. It was a forced monopoly, backed by law on one side and fleet power on the other. Salt became the first product through which Venice perfected a strategy they would repeat time and again. Identify a product people can't live without, seize control over its supply, and crush anyone trying to sell the same goods independently. Here's something that haunts the story. The facades of Venetian palaces, the pink marble, the intricate arches, the golden mosaics, were all paid for with money earned from people sold into slavery and from cities burned down to secure a monopoly on a preservative. Every column, every dock, every bridge, the cruelty behind them turned into stone. And by this point, the Republic was just getting started. Because salt and slaves were a local, regional business. What lay ahead was far bigger, an entire sea and all the grain that sailed across it. Imagine looking at a map of the Mediterranean through the eyes of a 10th century merchant. To the west lies the Holy Roman Empire, swelling with wealth, silver mines, bustling cities, and an insatiable hunger for luxury goods. To the east stands Byzantium, the heir to Rome, serving as the gateway for silk and spices flowing from Asia. Between them stretches a narrow waterway, the Adriatic Sea, and right in the middle of that stretch, perched on stilts in a lagoon, sits Venice. This was the shortest and safest route for luxury goods traveling from Constantinople to Europe, through the Adriatic Sea. Silk, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, all of it passed by Venetian docks. So here's the question. How do you change passing by into passing through? How do you make sure every single spice ship has to stop with you? The Republic's response was boldly outrageous. Venice simply declared the Adriatic Sea its own property, not just a zone of influence or an area of interest, actual ownership, legally. They officially renamed the sea the Venetian Gulf. This wasn't poetic license, it was a legal claim. Everything sailing these waters answered to their laws. In other words, an entire sea fell under a single ruler, and that ruler handed out fines. Claiming the sea on paper was only half the battle. They still had to make sure no one else could sail those waters without permission. To do this, the Republic used a tactic we'd now call an information monopoly. Venetian charts of safe channels, data on currents, depths, hidden shoals, everything was top secret. Not just hidden, but protected with paranoid vigilance. Navigational knowledge was treated like a military secret. To put it in modern terms, it was like the launch codes for nuclear weapons, only instead of warheads, it was trade routes. You could be a Genoese captain with 30 years of experience, but without Venetian Adriatic charts, the sea was a maze of rocks and shoals to you. Let's pause for a moment here. There's a common belief that the famous ritual where the Doge betroths himself to the sea, the Marriage of the Sea ceremony, was just a beautiful, decorative event. The story goes that the Doge sails out on a grand galley, throws a golden ring into the water, everyone applauds, and it looks impressive. But that's not the case. This was no celebration. It was a legal ceremony. Every year, in public, the head of state reaffirmed the Republic's ownership of the Adriatic Sea. The ring tossed into the waves wasn't a gift. It was a seal on a legal document. Ambassadors from foreign powers acted as witnesses. Try to dispute Venice's claim to the sea after that, and they'll show you a record of ceremonies going back 300 years. Now, here's where it gets truly fascinating. The city that claimed control over an entire sea didn't own a single field, not an inch of arable land. The bread, the staple food for 150,000 people, had to be bought wholesale from Sicily, Apulia, and even Egypt. You'd think that made Venice weak, dependent on outside supplies, vulnerable. But Venice turned that vulnerability into its greatest weapon. To control the grain trade, the Republic created a special agency called the Grain Overseers, or Provveditori alle Biave. This organization combined the roles of an agricultural ministry, customs authority, and trade syndicate all in one. Think of it like a modern cartel, but backed by the state seal and the power to use military force. The Grain Overseers set a rule that made foreign merchants grind their teeth. Any ship carrying grain entering the Adriatic Sea, no matter where it came from or who owned the cargo, had to first dock in Venice and offer its goods to Venetian brokers. Skipping this step was your right, sure, but it meant breaking the law of the Venetian lagoon, and lawbreakers weren't exactly welcome here. This was the same strategy they had perfected with salt, remember? Identify an essential commodity, seize control of its logistics, crush the competition. Now it was working on grain, only on a much bigger scale. When Europe faced poor harvests and bread prices soared, Venetian officials flipped the script. Instead of paying the market rate, Venice deliberately lowered the purchase prices at its port. Foreign merchants arrived with wheat, expecting to profit from hungry demand and high margins. Instead, they were offered prices below their costs. Could they refuse? Sure. But leaving the port with unsold cargo? That was illegal. The law was clear. The people got cheap bread. The merchants took losses. Venice maintained stability. But that was the peaceful version. There was another side to this story. In the 1590s, Europe faced a prolonged famine. Harvests failed year after year. Grain became more valuable than silver. In response, the Venetian Senate issued a decree that, when you think about it, sends chills down your spine. The captain of the Gulf, Capitano in Golfo, who commanded the Adriatic patrol fleet, was ordered to seize every single grain ship, no exceptions. Genoese, Ragusan, Ottoman, it didn't matter. Each ship was escorted straight to Venice. The grain was then purchased from the captain at a fixed price set by Venice itself. Fixed, meaning deliberately low. In other words, at a price that favored the buyer, not the seller. Here's the twist. The seized grain wasn't handed out right away. No, it was stockpiled. Then Venice sold it to neighboring cities and states, at prices Venice set. Ferrara running low on food? Mantua asking for bread? Sure, but only on our terms, with our markup, and political concessions to boot. It was state-sanctioned piracy, legalized extortion, and price fixing all rolled into one. And it wasn't carried out by a band of corsairs. This was a republic, with a parliament, a constitution, and an elected head of state. But having laws and guts wasn't enough to seize ships on the open sea. You needed the ships themselves, fast, armed vessels, rolling off the shipyard floor so often that no competitor could keep up. The year is 1574. French King Henry III arrives in Venice on a state visit. He receives a grand welcome, a lavish banquet, music, silverware, and wine imported all the way from Cyprus. But the centerpiece doesn't appear on the dining table. Instead, it's presented on the water. While the king eats, drinks, and engages in polite conversation, something else unfolds just beyond the banquet hall's walls. Along the Arsenal Canal, workers lay down the bare frame of a war galley, a wooden skeleton built without a single nail, no mast, no rudder. By the time Henry finishes his final glass and steps outside to the water, a fully equipped warship waits before him, with mast, with oars, crossbowmen standing ready on deck, battle ready. This isn't a legend, it's a carefully staged diplomatic performance designed with one clear purpose: to show the King of France exactly who he's dealing with. But how? How did a city built on stilts, wedged between marshlands and the sea, learn to do something the rest of Europe wouldn't figure out for another 400 years? The answer is the Arsenal. A sealed industrial complex spanning 46 hectares, that's about 65 football fields, all enclosed behind a high wall. You couldn't enter without a pass. You couldn't even peek inside. And anyone caught leaking information about what went on behind those walls faced execution. Now, we need to pause and clarify something. We tend to credit Henry Ford with inventing the assembly line in 1913. His Model T, the conveyor belt, workers stationed in fixed spots, it's textbook history. But the Venetians did exactly the same thing, 500 years before Ford. Only instead of cars, they were building war galleys, and instead of a conveyor belt, they used a canal. The principle was simple, yet all the more astonishing because of it. They towed the bare hull of a ship along a canal from one workshop to another. At the first stop, they installed the mast. At the second, they attached the oars. At the third, they stretched the ropes. At the fourth, they loaded the weapons. Each workshop handled a single task. Every part was standardized. An oar from one galley fit any other. A mast from a ship sunk off the coast of Crete could be swapped out with an identical one from a military base in Cyprus. This wasn't just repair. It was 20th century logistics, executed in an era when England was still burning witches. At its peak, the Arsenal produced one fully outfitted warship every single day. One ship, every day. No Mediterranean power could come close to that pace. This massive machine was operated by a group called the Arsenalati. 16,000 people, a whole city within the city. They were a hereditary caste. Father, son, and grandson, all shipbuilders. They passed down the secrets of their craft from generation to generation, living by strict rules. Privileges? Absolutely. Higher than average pay? Of course. The Doge's personal guard during ceremonies? Without question. But try explaining to an outsider exactly how the keel attaches to the frame, and you'd face execution. No trial, no appeal. 16,000 people. To grasp that scale, imagine the population of a typical European town of that era. A whole city that didn't farm, didn't trade, didn't worship. It built ships, and nothing else. Every single day. And do you know who captured the experience better than anyone? Dante Alighieri. Yes, the very Dante who wrote the Divine Comedy. He visited the Arsenal and was horrified. Cauldrons filled with boiling pitch pouring over ship hulls, thick black smoke curling over the canal. The furnace heat so intense it cracked the skin on his hands. The sharp smell of burning wood and molten sulfur. When Dante wrote about the fifth pit of the eighth circle of hell, where sinners are boiled alive in pitch, he wasn't imagining it. He was describing exactly what he saw with his own eyes at the Venetian shipyard. Hell was traced straight from the assembly line. But Arsenal wasn't just building ships. It was crafting weapons with a dual purpose. The Venetian galley was both a merchant vessel and a warship at once. Below deck lay a hold packed with spices, silk, and glass. Above, the deck bristled with crossbowmen, fully armed. In the morning, the galley carried pepper from Alexandria. By evening, it sank a pirate skiff. In Venice, the line between merchant and soldier simply didn't exist. Trade and war were one and the same enterprise. And here, the Republic took its next step, a move both calculated and ruthless. It created the Muda system, regular trade convoys guarded by warships. Sounds sensible. Pirates, storms, hostile fleets. A lone merchant on the open sea wouldn't last long. But the real purpose of the Muda wasn't safety, it was control. A merchant couldn't just set sail on his own, he had to rent space on the state galley. The route was fixed, the schedule was fixed, prices were approved by the Senate. Want to trade with Constantinople? Wait for the convoy. Trade with Egypt? Wait for a different convoy. Try to bypass the system and sail solo? Go ahead. But from that moment on, you were a pirate, a competitor, an enemy of the state. For Venice, those three words all meant the same thing. And if you weren't just a merchant, but an entire city that didn't like Venetian rules, then the fleet came knocking. Not to storm the city, that was costly and messy. To blockade it instead. The year was 1345. The Dalmatian city of Zadar, called Zara by the Italians, rose up in rebellion. It refused to pay tribute. It tried to break free from Venetian control. The response was simple. Venetian galleys formed a half circle at the harbor's entrance. Not a single ship could get in. Not a single ship could get out. No grain, no fish, no fresh water from the mainland. For 16 months, the city held out. It surrendered only when there was nothing left to eat. Venice didn't lose a single soldier. Why risk lives when you can just wait for hunger to do the job for you? Here's the remarkable truth. A city without an army, without farmland, and without natural resources built an industrial machine 400 years before the Industrial Revolution. It standardized parts 5 centuries before international quality standards even existed. It created a supply chain system that modern military analysts compare to the most advanced logistics of the 21st century. All of this happened on swampy islands, where house foundations rest on oak piles driven deep into the mud. With such a fleet and such a system in hand, the Republic was ready to stop serving others and to challenge those it once called protectors. The year is 828. 2 Venetian merchants, Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello, stand inside the crypt of an ancient temple in Alexandria. They pull the relics of Saint Mark the Apostle from a sarcophagus. The air is thick with a smell that brings tears to their eyes, not from the relics themselves, but from pork. According to legend, the merchants wrapped the holy remains in pieces of pork and cabbage leaves, hoping the Muslim customs officers wouldn't dare inspect the cargo. Their plan worked. The inspectors recoiled at the basket, and the relics sailed quietly back to Venice. It sounds like the scheme of 2 swindlers, but behind this gambit stood something much deeper. Before the theft, Venice had no patron saint of its own, meaning it lacked spiritual authority. Constantinople saw it as just a trading suburb. Alexandria, Rome, Jerusalem, each great city had its apostle. Venice had none. The relics of Saint Mark instantly elevated the Republic's standing in the Christian world. Suddenly, this marshy city had its own evangelist. The winged lion, Mark's symbol, became Venice's emblem. From that moment on, the Republic acted like it belonged at the table of the great powers. But the real turning point didn't happen in a crypt. It happened at the negotiation table, 254 years later. The year is 1182. Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos faces a desperate situation. From southern Italy, the Normans, once Vikings who settled in Sicily and crowned themselves kings, are advancing into his lands. The Byzantine Empire lacks a strong navy, so Alexios turns to Venice for military aid, and Venice answers the call. Venetian galleys drive back the Normans, but this victory came at a steep price. The emperor issued the Crucible, the Golden Bull, a formal decree sealed with gold. It freed Venetian merchants from the 10% trade tax called the commercium. That 10% was the very tax everyone else paid, including the Byzantines themselves. Let's pause here and really grasp what's happening. Byzantine merchants trade within their own country, and they pay a 10% tax. Venetian merchants trade in a foreign land, and they pay nothing. With the same goods, the same quality, the same demand, the Venetian automatically earns 10% more profit. Every deal, every day, every year. Local merchants simply couldn't compete. It's like if, in a modern city, one supermarket chain was allowed to skip taxes while everyone else paid full price. After 5 years, only one would survive. At first, it seemed like Byzantium had gotten off lightly. The Normans retreated, order was restored, and trade carried on. But that calm was deceptive. Because the Venetians didn't just get a tax break, they were granted an entire district in Constantinople, right on the shore of the Golden Horn, at the very heart of the city's commerce. Docks, warehouses, homes, churches, bakeries, all part of this quarter. And the strangest part? This district operated under Venetian law, Venetian courts, Venetian police, Venetian trade rules. In the middle of the capital of a 1,000-year-old empire, a state within a state had emerged, and Byzantium couldn't interfere. It's like having a neighborhood in downtown Moscow, where a foreign country's laws apply, and the Russian police simply don't enter. Remember this district on the Golden Horn. It's going to play a pivotal role. Here's a paradox worth saying out loud. Byzantium stood as one of the world's largest economies. Constantinople was a bustling city of hundreds of thousands, a crossroads of trade between Europe and Asia. Silk, spices, gold, grain, all funneled through this hub. And this massive engine started running for Venice. Venetian merchants bought goods right at the source, in Constantinople's markets, at Black Sea ports, along the coast of Asia Minor, and sold them in Europe with markups reaching as high as 500%. 500! Byzantium produced and extracted. Venice packaged and resold. The profits flowed westward. There's a fungus in nature called cordyceps. Its spores invade an insect's body, growing through its tissues and taking control of its nervous system. The ant keeps walking, eating, and moving its jaws. From the outside, it seems alive, but it's no longer its own master. Every movement is controlled by the fungus, which drains nutrients from its body. The ant doesn't realize it's dead. It's simply following someone else's program. Venice grew inside Byzantium in much the same way. Trade routes thrived, markets buzzed, gold clinked in the coffers. But year by year, more of that gold flowed not into the Byzantine treasury, but into Venetian chests. The empire still looked alive, but it no longer acted on its own will. And simply siphoning resources wasn't enough for Venice. When foreign debts and its own ambitions converged, the Parasite decided it no longer needed its host. The year 1201. Lido Island, a narrow strip of sand at the entrance to the Venetian lagoon. 33,000 people stand on the shore, knights, foot soldiers, squires, servants. The army of the Fourth Crusade. They've come here to board ships bound for Egypt. Their mission? To reclaim the Holy Sepulchre. But there's a catch. Ships cost money. Venice handed them the bill, 85,000 silver marks to cover the fleet's transport. To put that in perspective, that's about 20 tons of silver, equal to the annual income of several European kingdoms. The Crusaders scraped together all they could, emptied chests, melted down family silver. It still wasn't enough. They fell short by 34,000 marks. That's nearly 40% of the total contract. Here's where the trap's mechanics come into play. Venice didn't just build ships. It halted commercial shipping for a year and a half to fulfill the Crusaders' order. The arsenal shipyards worked around the clock. The city put everything into this contract. So underpayment wasn't just a hassle. It threatened the entire republic's economy. Letting debtors go without paying meant writing off losses. And Venice simply didn't know how to absorb losses. Doge Enrico Dandolo, a blind man over 90 years old, looks at this army and doesn't see pilgrims. He sees an asset. 33,000 armed men who owe him. He realizes he can direct these men, not to Egypt, but to where Venice needs strength most. Their first target was Zadar, a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast, a rival in trade. Zadar had placed itself under the protection of the Hungarian king and was intercepting the routes used by Venetian galleys. Dandolo proposed a deal. If they captured Zadar, he would forgive part of their debt. The Crusaders agreed. The army, originally assembled to fight Muslim forces, laid siege to and plundered the Catholic city. Pope Innocent III excommunicated everyone involved, but the Venetians didn't care. Zadar fell in November 1202. Then a figure emerges who turns a commercial venture into a geopolitical disaster. Alexios Angelos, a Byzantine prince, overthrown and blinded by his own relatives, arrives at the Crusaders' camp with an offer. Help me reclaim the throne in Constantinople, and I will fund your campaign, provide 10,000 soldiers, and bring the Eastern Church under Rome's authority. The promise sounded incredible. It was incredible. Alexios controlled neither the treasury, the army, nor the patriarch. But that didn't bother Dandolo. He didn't need Alexios on the throne. He needed an excuse to send 33,000 debt-ridden soldiers to the walls of Venice's main commercial rival. People often say the Crusaders were savage barbarians, recklessly destroying everything in their path. But let's pause for a moment and set the record straight. The Crusaders were indeed brutal. They looted, killed, and committed horrific acts. Yet they weren't the ones choosing their targets. Every twist in their route, first Zadar, then Constantinople, followed Venice's financial interests. The soldiers were merely tools. The real power sat inside the Doge's palace. In April 1204, the army launched its assault. Constantinople, a city of around 400,000, stood behind triple layers of walls that had resisted Arabs, Bulgarians, and Rus for 8 centuries. Venetian galleys pressed right up against the sea walls. From their masts, they swung assault bridges directly onto the towers. The city fell in just 2 days. 3 days of looting followed. But the word looting doesn't quite capture what Venice was doing. Looting implies chaos. This was an audit. While French and Flemish knights looted gold and tore down silk curtains, Venetian agents operated with a clear agenda. From the hippodrome, they took the quadriga, 4 bronze horses cast back in antiquity. Each horse stands over 6.5 feet tall at the shoulder, coated in a thin layer of gold. They carefully removed them from their pedestals, loaded them onto galleys, and sent them to Venice. Today, replicas stand on the facade of St. Mark's Basilica. The originals? They're preserved inside, behind glass. More than 800 years have passed, and the horses remain in place. Alongside relics in bronze, they seized porphyry, a deep red stone symbolizing imperial authority. They took enamels, icons framed in gold, and sacred relics. Each item wasn't just a trophy, it was merchandise with a specific market value. Relics were sold to cathedrals across Europe. Bronze either got melted down or used to adorn Venice's own churches. Venice didn't collect treasures. Venice turned them into profit. Here's what really reveals Dandolo's mindset. According to the division terms, Venice received 3/8 of the entire Byzantine Empire's territory. 3/8. That's a massive chunk. Coastlines, cities, farmland. You'd think they'd just take the land, install governors, and start collecting taxes. But Venice did something different. Instead of grabbing territory, they took control of strategic points. Crete, the largest island in the eastern Mediterranean, commanded the sea routes between Egypt and Greece. Euboea, an island off the coast of Attica, controlled traffic into the Aegean Sea. Then there were the key ports on the Peloponnese, Modon and Coron, later known as the Republic's Eyes. The logic is simple. Holding on to territory is expensive. You need administration, garrisons, courts, roads. But a port? It's a checkpoint. Whoever controls the port collects a toll from every ship that passes through. No need to farm, build, or manage the population. All you need is a fortress and a handful of galleys. Stato de Mar, meaning state on the sea, was a network of strongholds stretching from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. It wasn't built on conquest, but on logistics. The Crusader army never made it to the Holy Land. Not a single one of their 33,000 soldiers saw the walls of Jerusalem. Yet Venice secured a trade monopoly over the entire eastern Mediterranean. The cross on their banner was just a logo. Behind it stood the power of accounting. This flood of incredible wealth pouring into the city brought a new challenge. When you control so much gold, so many trade routes, so many ports, your greatest enemy isn't across the sea anymore. He's sitting in the neighboring palace, scheming to take your seat on the council. And they found a solution, swift, elegant, and ruthless. In 1297, the Venetian elite pulled off what historians call the serrata, literally the closure. They shut the Great Council. From that moment on, only families with ancestors who had already served on the council could claim a seat. Not based on merit, not on wealth, not on intelligence, but on bloodline. If your grandfather never sat on the council, you never would. Not you, not your children, not their children. Suddenly, the Republic, a state meant to belong to everyone, became a closed club reserved for just a few hundred families. To keep things clear, who belonged and who didn't, in 1315 they created the Libro de Oro, or the Golden Book. It served as the registry for the ruling class. This thick volume listed the aristocratic families entitled to power. If your name wasn't in that book, you were a second-class citizen. You could trade, grow wealthy, build a marble palazzo, but you couldn't touch the levers of power. It was like a corporate charter, locking in the list of shareholders forever. No new shares would ever be issued. Here's the interesting part. Among these elite families, a distinct class emerged over time, the Barnabotti. These were once aristocrats who had squandered their fortunes but still held their seats in the council. They could vote, but they had no money left. So they started trading the one valuable thing they had left, their votes. Wealthy families bought up the Barnabotti votes during elections, and the system tolerated it. In effect, it was legalized corruption built right into the Constitution. Not a bug, a feature, as we might say today, because it allowed power to shift within the ruling class without bloodshed or coups. Let's pause here to clear up a common misconception. Many think of the Doge as a Venetian king, a powerful ruler crowned in gold. But let me spend a few seconds to put this myth to rest. The Doge was actually the most restricted person in Venice. He was forbidden from leaving the city. He wasn't allowed to conduct business outside the Republic. His children couldn't marry foreigners without special permission from the council. He couldn't accept gifts from foreign ambassadors. Not even open diplomatic mail alone, only in the presence of advisors. The Doge sat in the palace, surrounded by luxury and watchers. A high-profile hostage, a symbol of the state stripped of everything but his title. A golden cage, where the bars were paragraphs of law. And the oligarchy thought, the system is secure, access is blocked, the ruler neutralized, and the balance of power rests in our hands. Then came the year 1310. Aristocrat Baimonte Tiepolo tried to overthrow the government. The coup failed. Rebels were crushed right there in St. Mark's Square. But the fear lingered. From that fear, a body was born that would change Venice forever. The Council of Ten, Consiglio dei Dieci, started out as a temporary commission to investigate the conspiracy. Temporary, just for a couple of months. It lasted for 450 years. The Council of Ten turned into a permanent secret police force, wielding power above the law and even the Doge himself. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Venetians feared their own enforcement agency just as much as they feared conspirators. So they built safeguards against themselves. Council members served one-year terms with no chance for re-election. And no two members from the same family could serve at the same time. This meant that the Republic's most powerful body was completely refreshed every 12 months. Imagine if the head of intelligence changed every January, replaced by someone from a totally different clan. The Council of Ten gathered information through a method that sends chills down your spine. The Bocca di Leone, or lion's mouths. These were stone reliefs shaped like lion heads, with a narrow slit instead of a mouth, embedded into walls all over the city. Anyone, a neighbor, a servant, a business partner, could slip a note of accusation into this slit, anonymously. No signature, no risk for the informer, but severe consequences for the accused. The council investigated, the council judged, the council acted. Venice became a city where every wall had ears and a stone mouth ready to swallow their secrets. All information funneled to just 10 people, and those 10 knew Venice inside and out. This skill, the art of gathering, organizing, and profiting from information, would soon become the Republic's greatest weapon, far beyond the lagoon's edge. And now, peak moment. The year 1355. Doge Marino Faliero, the head of state, a man whose portrait should hang in the grand hall of the Doge's palace among his predecessors, has had enough. He's tired of being a puppet. He wants real power. Faliero plots a simple plan: eliminate the council members and seize absolute control. The conspiracy is uncovered. The Council of 10 puts the Doge on trial. The sentence? Death. Faliero is beheaded on the very stairs of his own palace, and in the spot where his portrait was meant to hang in the ceremonial gallery, they draped a black curtain. Just a piece of black cloth. No name, no face, no explanation. It still hangs there today. For those not even sentenced to a public execution, a quieter fate awaited. Nightfall. A boat. The canal of the orphans. The canal of the forsaken. They would tie a stone to the condemned's feet and drop them into the water. No witnesses, no records. Fishing in that canal was forbidden, under penalty of death, to ensure no one accidentally hauled up what the city preferred to forget. This system, built by the wealthiest families to protect their fortunes, ended up executing its own ruler and drowning dissenters in shadowy depths. This machine of internal terror worked flawlessly. Coups stopped. Stability prevailed, absolute and unshakable. And it was this very stability, bought at the price of paranoia and midnight drownings, that allowed the Republic to quietly focus on what it did best: stealing other people's secrets. Every empire is built on land. Take a province, station a garrison, appoint a governor, collect taxes. That's how Rome operated. That's how Persia operated. That's how every empire worked, except Venice. The Venetian Empire, officially called Stato de Mar, meaning sea state, didn't conquer continents. It seized key points. A port here, a fortress there, an island in between. No vast territories, no thousands of miles of borders to defend. Just a chain of bases stretching from the lagoon all the way to the Black Sea. Each link in that chain stood no more than 2 or 3 days' journey from the next. A galley would leave one port in the morning and arrive at the next 2 days later. Fresh water, supplies, repairs, intelligence. Then off again. In simple terms, Venice built a network of fueling stations along the main highway of the medieval world. 2 fortresses on the southern tip of the Peloponnese, Modon and Coron, were called the main eyes of the Republic by the Venetians themselves. Not shields, not swords, eyes, because this spot controlled the primary sea route between east and west. Whoever held Modon and Coron saw everything: who was sailing, where they were headed, what cargo they carried, and in what quantity. Control over information began long before the Rialto Bridge. But Crete tells a different story. An island the size of a small country, Venice transformed it not into a lookout post, but into a full-fledged production base. Grain, wine, shipbuilding timber, everything the fleet and the metropolis needed was grown and gathered here. Crete fed the machine. Without it, the chain would have fallen apart into isolated outposts, each relying on supplies shipped all the way from Venice, a journey that took weeks. And this is where the story gets really fascinating. People often picture Venice as a spice empire: pepper, cinnamon, cloves, the big-ticket items. But let's pause and take a closer look. Sure, spices brought in massive profits. Yet anyone with a ship and enough capital could haul them. The Genoese did, the Aragonese did, even the Florentines gave it a shot. Venice's true monopoly wasn't what it shipped, it was what it knew. Spices were just goods. Information was the real weapon. The area around the Rialto Bridge functioned like the first financial trading floor in history. But instead of screens, there were real people. Merchants, brokers, insurers, money changers, all gathered within a 200-meter radius. News of a storm in the Aegean Sea would drive up grain prices just an hour after a messenger disembarked from a galley. Rumors of plague in Alexandria would crash insurance rates on the Egyptian trade route the very same day. This was an immediate, direct conversion of information into money, something Wall Street wouldn't master for another 500 years. Yet the Venetians made it work without telegraphs or fiber optics. They relied on swift galleys and people who knew how to listen. Venetian diplomats had a real talent for listening. Every ambassador, whether in Paris, Madrid, Constantinople, or at the Pope's court, had to regularly send two kinds of reports back to the Senate. First came the dispatches, quick, up-to-the-minute updates on who met whom, troop movements, and the latest court gossip. Then there were the relations, detailed analytical summaries of the host country. These covered the state of the economy, the army's readiness, the ruler's personality, weaknesses, and closest confidants. In other words, a complete intelligence profile, crafted by someone officially invited to royal receptions and dinners. This was an official spy network, operating openly under diplomatic cover. And it didn't rely on the skill of any one ambassador. The system followed a strict format: what to report, in what order, and how often. Ambassadors came and went, but the steady stream of intelligence never stopped. But Venice wanted more. The Republic created an official role, the Cipher Secretary. This person's sole job was to crack encrypted messages sent by others. Giovanni Soro was the most famous to hold this position. He broke the codes used by kings, popes, and military commanders. When a letter was intercepted, it landed in Soro's hands. He decrypted its contents, then sent the original on to its recipient, who never suspected anyone had read it. Meanwhile, a copy was stored forever in the Republic's archives. Here, the entire system clicks into place. The ambassador in Paris learns that France is facing a bad harvest. A dispatch is sent to Venice. At Rialto, this news spreads weeks before anyone outside the French court even hears about it. Venetian merchants start buying up grain at the current prices. When the poor harvest becomes public and prices soar, the grain sells at a huge markup. Insider trading on the scale of entire nations. But in the 14th century, no one went to jail for it. Instead, they were rewarded with titles. You might think a system built on a network of bases, professional spies, and a monopoly on foreign secrets would be bulletproof. Yet it had one critical weakness. This whole machine only worked as long as trade routes ran through the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, somewhere in the shipyards of Lisbon, vessels were already being built to sail around Africa. The year is 1379. The Lagoon. Genoese war galleys lie anchored off Chioggia, a fishing village just 12 miles from St. Mark's Square. Venice is trapped. Its path to the open sea is blocked. Supplies are cut off. One more push, and the city will fall. Venice's fiercest and most ruthless rival was the Republic of Genoa. Two predatory trading powers built on the same principle: control over the sea routes. They clashed for dominance over the Mediterranean. Their war lasted centuries. Not just one generation or two. Entire dynasties were born and died while Venice and Genoa tore into each other. The Battle of Chioggia marked a critical moment when the Genoese fleet almost seized Venice itself. Literally, the enemy's ships were inside the lagoon, able to see the city's bell towers. Venice held firm, while Genoa eventually weakened. But the victory came at a heavy cost the Republic would bear for years: a battered fleet, drained treasury, and exhausted manpower. It might have seemed like the biggest threat was over, finally allowing Venice to catch its breath. But just as the Genoese danger faded, a new challenge emerged, one that put all of Europe face to face with Venice. The year is 1509. The Pope, the King of France, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and the King of Aragon, virtually every major monarch on the continent, join forces in the League of Cambrai. Their single goal? To destroy Venice. This city had grown too wealthy, too powerful, and too boldly stretched its influence onto the Italian mainland. The Pope imposed an interdict on the Republic, a complete ban from the Church. In the 16th century, this was no mere formality. It meant no communion, no funeral rites, no weddings anywhere within Venetian territory. From Rome's perspective, the souls of Venetians were beyond salvation. And do you know what Venice did? It ignored it. State interests outweighed the Pope's curse. The Republic fought back, using skillful diplomacy to fracture the coalition, turning allies against each other. It survived. But every crisis like this drained resources and attention. Meanwhile, the real blow was coming from a completely different direction. This is where we need to pause, because what happened next wasn't a war, a conspiracy, or a plague. It was a discovery, one that shattered Venice's entire model more effectively than any army could. In 1499, Vasco da Gama returned to Lisbon from India. He had sailed around Africa and brought back pepper, cinnamon, cloves, the very goods Venice had built its fortune on for centuries. But now, none of that required caravans crossing through Syria, supply bases on Crete, or alliances with Mamluk Egypt. Venice's role as middleman was obsolete, completely. Venetian diplomat and chronicler Girolamo Priuli recorded words in his diary that deserve to be heard. When this news reached Venice, the entire city was shaken. The wisest senators judged it the worst news the Republic had ever received. It was clear, the city was losing the vital force that had come from the spice trade, and there was no way to stop it. He wasn't wrong. The numbers were brutal. Pepper, the cornerstone of Venetian trade, suddenly sold for a fifth of its price in Lisbon compared to Venice. A fifth. This wasn't just competition, it was a death sentence. Where once any European trader eager for spices would head straight to Rialto, now they turned their backs and sailed for Lisbon's port. Why pay 5 times more? Venice's entire infrastructure, its warehouses, galleys, trading posts, and spy networks, lost value overnight. It was like someone had built a free expressway alongside the toll road that everyone had relied on until then. But the blow didn't stop there. Alongside this geographic shift, a geopolitical storm was gathering strength. In 1453, Constantinople fell under the relentless assault of the Ottoman Empire. For Venice, this wasn't just a distant change of power. It meant losing a vital trading partner and stepping into direct military conflict with a rising empire growing faster than the Republic could keep pace with. What followed was a cascade of losses. In 1470, Venice lost Negroponte, now known as Euboea, a key naval base in the Aegean Sea. The Venetian garrison was wiped out. By 1503, a peace treaty forced Venice to cede territories in Greece to the Ottomans. Then, in 1669, after 25 years of siege, a quarter of a century of relentless fighting, Crete finally fell. 25 years, an entire generation was born and raised amid war over a single island, and still they lost. Here's what happened. There wasn't a single culprit. Genoa wore Venice down through centuries of naval warfare. European monarchs tried to strangle it with coalitions. Portuguese explorers devalued its trade. The Ottomans seized its bases. Venice could have survived each blow on its own. But taken together, over 200 years, these forces formed a perfect storm, one with no escape. Neither its spy network, nor diplomatic skill, nor the Mediterranean's strongest fleet could save it when trade routes shifted, and shifted forever. Some Venetian nobles seemed to see this coming before the rest. Quietly, they began pulling capital out of maritime trade. Instead, they invested in something entirely new for the Republic: land on the mainland. But by then, this was a different Venice altogether. The Terra Fanima, the mainland territory that belonged to the Republic. This is where the wealth, long circulating through maritime caravans, began to flow. Venetian patricians, the very families who had built trading empires on the water for generations, started buying vineyards, farmland, and villas on solid ground. Instead of risky voyages across the Mediterranean, they secured steady income from peasants. Instead of storms and pirates, they harvested olives. In short, these former sea wolves had turned into landed aristocrats. Today, it's easy to call that cowardice. The great merchants just got scared of competition and fled to the countryside, some say. But imagine yourself as a patrician at the end of the 16th century. The Portuguese are already shipping pepper around all your trade routes. The Ottomans control half of your former trading posts. Spanish silver from the New World is flooding the market, devaluing your currency. In this situation, moving your assets inland wasn't panic. It was a calculated move. The sea no longer provided like it used to, but the land always provides. Here's the strange part. The city that turned away from the sea didn't die. It was reborn. After losing its grip on global trade, Venice underwent its final, and most surprising, transformation in 1,000 years of history. The former World Warehouse became an amusement park. The city literally invented the modern tourism industry. There were carnivals that lasted for months, theater seasons that drew crowds from all over Europe, and the crowning touch, the very first legal casino in history. The Ridotto, opened in 1638 at the Church of San Moise, became a place where masked aristocrats gambled their fortunes under the watchful eye of the state. Venice realized before anyone else, if you can't sell pepper, sell pleasure instead, and the profit margins were just as good. A city of masks, a city of celebration, a place where anything goes. That's what the Republic became, a power that once set silk prices stretching from London all the way to Baghdad. Young English lords traveled here to complete their education, the so-called Grand Tour, and ended up leaving behind fortunes in the casinos. Fortunes their grandfathers had earned from wool. The irony? Venice lost control over trade goods, but gained control over everyone else's leisure time. And that system worked, until a man arrived who cared nothing for masks or carnivals. The year was 1797. Napoleon Bonaparte stood with his army on the mainland. The French Navy, however, lacked the strength to storm the island city, but an assault never came. The last Doge of the Venetian Republic, Ludovico Manin, called a meeting of the Great Council. They couldn't reach a quorum. Out of more than 600 members, only 537 showed up. Manin proposed renouncing power and surrendering the city. The vote was 512 in favor, 30 against, and 5 abstaining. The Doge removed his horned hat, the corno, a symbol of authority worn by the Republic's rulers for over 1,000 years, and handed it to his servant, saying, "Take it away, I won't need it anymore." The millennium-old Republic died on a single vote, without a single shot fired, no siege, no storming, no heroic last stand. The city that had defended Crete for 25 years surrendered to Napoleon in one evening. And this is where it gets truly fascinating, because the Republic's physical demise didn't mean the death of its innovations. Take a world map and find Singapore, a tiny island sitting at the crossroads of sea routes between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It has no natural resources, no vast territory, no powerful army, but it controls the Strait of Malacca, a passageway that handles 40% of global maritime trade. A city-state built not on land or military might, but on control of a critical infrastructure hub. The Venetian model, exactly the same. Dubai, a desert transformed into a trading hub. Free economic zones, minimal taxes, a strategic spot linking Europe, Asia, and Africa. A port, an airport, a financial center, all converging on key routes. Once again, the same blueprint. Don't produce yourself. Become the indispensable middleman between those who do. The Venetian model of empire, built on controlling ports and straits, didn't vanish with the Doges. Instead, it spread across the globe, taking root in every city that understood one crucial truth: geography is a resource. More than that, it's the ultimate resource. But this is just the economic side. There's something less obvious, yet perhaps even more important. Remember the system called relazioni? Those detailed reports Venetian ambassadors compiled after every mission. They recorded the political climate, the ruler's weaknesses, the army's condition, the mood of the people. Everything was documented, analyzed, and archived. This wasn't mere espionage. It was analytical intelligence, gathering both open and secret information, organizing it, and turning it into strategic decisions. This system became the prototype for the analytical departments in modern intelligence agencies. When an analyst in Langley or at the headquarters of any other intelligence service writes a report on the political situation in a foreign country, they unknowingly follow a format refined by Venetian diplomats 500 years ago. Different names, different technology, a different scale, but the structure remains the same. Network economy, information dominance, controlling key nodes instead of territories. Analytical intelligence as the foundation of national strategy. None of this was invented in the 21st century. It all started with Venice. Poor Ludovico Manin. He surrendered the Corno, believing it was the final chapter. But in reality, the system he handed over to Napoleon had long since lived apart from the city on the water. It had woven itself into the very architecture of the modern world, so deeply that we stopped noticing it. Like the foundation beneath your feet when you're standing on the 10th floor. The Republic died. The method did not.